Imagine a dark and turbulent time, an era when the land of Israel had no leadership, no king to guide its people. This was a time of anarchy, where everyone did what seemed right in their own eyes. The tribes of Israel were scattered, united only by their common heritage, but divided by their own agendas and conflicts. It was a period marked by chaos, rash actions, and often the absence of justice. The Book of Judges tells stories from this uncertain time, stories that reveal both the darkness of the human heart and the fragility of society without clear leadership. Judges 19 stands out as one of the most disturbing of these narratives, a story that goes beyond mere disorder to plunge into the depths of human tragedy. And so, the backdrop of this story rises, an Israel without a king, a people without direction, and a society on the brink of moral collapse. It is in this unsettling scene that we are introduced to characters whose ordinary lives will, in the blink of an eye, be tragically transformed by a chain of dark and devastating events. Prepare yourself, for this is a story that exposes the brutality and consequences of a world where justice is lacking, and darkness prevails in the hearts of men. Amidst the shadows of this uncertain time, we are introduced to a Levite. A man who, despite his position as a servant of God, is not immune to life's complications. He had a concubine, a woman who lived with him, but for unknown reasons, a rift occurred. She left his house and returned to her father's home in the distant region of Bethlehem in Judah. The reason for her departure is unclear, perhaps it was a quarrel, perhaps a hurt, but the result was evident, she no longer wanted to be with him. Months passed, 4 months of silence, until the Levite, perhaps moved by longing, perhaps by duty or the desire for reconciliation, decided to travel to bring her back. He did not take a large entourage, just a servant and 2 donkeys, enough for a journey he hoped would end in peace and resolution. When he arrived at the woman's father's house, the reception was warm. The father, instead of showing any resentment, welcomed him with great hospitality, as if this visit brought a breath of hope for redemption for his daughter and the Levite. The days passed in feasting and friendly conversation, the father always trying to keep the Levite for one more day. But there was an underlying tension. A sense that, despite the apparent reconciliation, something had not been fully resolved. And while they continued delaying their departure, a feeling of urgency began to grow. The days of feasting and hospitality stretched on, the woman's father repeatedly insisting that the Levite stay one more night, one more meal. Each morning, when the Levite decided to leave, the father persuaded him to stay until evening. Food, drink, and rest seemed endless, as if the father was trying to prolong the moment of departure, fearing what might come next. However, after several days, the Levite finally made the firm decision to leave. With the sun already fading on the horizon, he could no longer delay his return. He, his concubine, and the servant left the woman's father's house with a sense of resignation, knowing that the journey was only beginning. The reconciliation had been reached, at least in part, and now it was time to face the way back. As they walked, darkness fell quickly, and the Levite realized that the return journey would not be easy. They needed to find a safe place to spend the night, but with the city of Jebus, which would later be called Jerusalem, in sight, the Levite decided he could not trust a foreign city of non-Israelites. Determined to spend the night among his own people, the Levite preferred to press on, even if it meant traveling for a few more hours in the growing darkness. Darkness fell rapidly, enveloping the small group as they continued their journey, eyes fixed on the road, the silence filling the air. The Levite, steadfast in his decision, refused to stop in Jebus, the foreign city ahead. He was convinced it would be safer to continue to a city of his own tribe, where he could count on the hospitality and sense of community of his own people. As they pressed on, they spotted the small town of Gibeah, belonging to the tribe of Benjamin. The Levite, exhausted from the journey, decided that this would be the place where they could finally rest. But upon entering Gibeah, something strange happened. The city was quiet, almost deserted. They sat in the town square, waiting for someone to invite them in, a common practice in Israel, where hospitality was a sacred duty. But time passed, and no one welcomed them. The night deepened, and the cold indifference of the town began to be felt as much as the chill of the night. The Levite, his concubine, and the servant were at the mercy of fate, waiting for someone to break that silence. The town, which should have been a refuge, now seemed a hostile place, and the sense of safety the Levite had sought among his own people began to fade. The night wore on, and the Levite, his concubine, and the servant remained in the square, surrounded only by the darkness and the uncomfortable silence of Gibeah. The town, which should have been a place of refuge, greeted them with unexpected coldness. Time seemed to drag on, and the expectation of finding shelter began to turn into unease. And then, just as despair began to set in, a movement appeared in the darkness. An old man, coming in from the fields, saw them in the square. He approached slowly, the starlight reflecting in his tired but kind eyes. He was a foreigner in Gibeah, originally from the hill country of Ephraim, but he had lived there for some time. Seeing the Levite and his small group, he quickly understood their situation. They had been abandoned by the community of Gibeah. With a gesture of compassion, he offered them shelter in his home, warning them not to spend the night in the square. The Levite, relieved to finally find hospitality, gratefully followed the man. They entered the old man's modest house, where they were received with food and drink. The atmosphere began to change. For the first time since leaving Bethlehem, the Levite and his concubine felt a moment of rest. But even with this brief respite, there was a tension in the air, a disquieting stillness that hung over the town. And then, just as they prepared to finally relax, the worst was yet to come, for the night in Gibeah concealed a darkness far deeper than any of them could have imagined. The night finally reached its peak, and the Levite, his concubine, and the servant began to feel the relief of rest in the old man's house. They ate, drank, and for a brief moment, it seemed they were safe, far from the external threats the town might have posed. The soft glow of a lamp illuminated the modest surroundings, and the atmosphere was calm. The host, with his gentle gestures, did everything he could to make his guests feel welcome. However, this tranquility was abruptly shattered. Heavy, insistent knocks sounded at the door, and soon the house was surrounded by wicked men from the town. They shouted, demanding that the Levite be handed over to them. The nature of their words was dark and threatening, their intent clear: they wanted to commit violence against the Levite. Fear filled the room. The old man, in despair, went out to confront the men, trying to calm their fury. He pleaded with them, begging them not to commit such wickedness. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The men continued to demand the Levite's presence. The old man, in a desperate act of trying to save his guest, offered his own daughter and the Levite's concubine, begging the crowd to spare them and at least preserve the honor of his house. It was a shocking moment, where morality itself was twisted under the weight of imminent violence. And then, in an act of cowardice and desperation, the concubine was given to the crowd. The Levite, either unable or unwilling to stop it, allowed her to be taken. The door closed, and inside the house, the silence was suffocating. Outside, however, the cries and sounds of suffering filled the night as the tragedy began to unfold in its most brutal form. The darkness of Gibeah now revealed itself fully, and the horrors of that night would be impossible to erase. The night dragged on, slow and cruel. Outside the house, the mob, consumed by wickedness, relentlessly abused the concubine. The sounds that echoed in the darkness were of a brutality few could have imagined, and inside the house, there was only silence. The Levite remained, seemingly powerless, as the tragedy unfolded outside. The weight of the choice he made hung heavy in the air, but now it was too late to reverse the course of events. The entire night, the concubine was subjected to the mob's cruelty. There was no rescue, no mercy. The town that should have offered hospitality became a scene of horror and barbarity. And as darkness finally began to give way to the first light of dawn, the mob dispersed. They left the concubine, collapsed and wounded, at the doorstep of the house. Silence returned as the first rays of sunlight touched the ground. The door to the house opened, and the Levite stepped out, finding the concubine lying at the threshold, her hands outstretched toward the door, as if in her final strength, she had tried to reach the shelter that had been denied her. He looked at her, but there was a cold distance in his gaze. He simply said, "Get up, let's go." But she did not move. Her body was still, lifeless. She had died there, at the door of that house, after a night of unimaginable suffering. The Levite, without tears or lament, took her body and placed it on one of the donkeys. He returned home, but not in silence. What he did next would shock all the tribes of Israel and unleash a fury no one could have predicted. The tragedy of Gibeah was far from over. In fact, the true devastation was just beginning. With the lifeless body of his concubine loaded on the donkey, the Levite began his journey home. The weight of the tragedy hung over him, but instead of it weighing on his spirit, it seemed to fuel a cold determination. When he arrived at his home, what followed was an act that went beyond pain and mourning, something as shocking as the night itself in Gibeah. The Levite, with disturbing calm, took a knife and, with methodical precision, cut his concubine's body into 12 parts. Each part, still bleeding, was sent to one of the tribes of Israel. This cruel and symbolic act was a clear message, a call for justice, a summons for vengeance. Each tribe that received a part of the body was faced with the undeniable evidence of what had happened in Gibeah, and the outrage began to spread like wildfire. The leaders of the tribes gathered, perplexed and furious at the brutality of the act. They knew that this atrocity could not be ignored. They demanded to know who had committed such a crime, and the Levite told his version of the events, highlighting the barbarity of the men of Gibeah and the terrible fate that had befallen his concubine. The story spread quickly, and soon all the tribes of Israel were preparing to act. A sense of justice, mixed with anger, swept across the nation. What had begun as an isolated tragedy was now on the verge of triggering a full-blown war. The tribes, united by their outrage, decided that the city of Gibeah and the tribe of Benjamin must pay for this wickedness. The flames of vengeance had been ignited, and nothing could extinguish them. The call to war echoed throughout the land of Israel, and the course of events was about to escalate into something far greater and more destructive than anyone could have imagined on that fateful day. The cry for vengeance reverberated throughout Israel, and what had started as an isolated act of brutality now escalated into a national crisis. All the tribes of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, gathered as one at Mizpah, called by their outrage and the promise of justice. The Levite, in the midst of the assembly, recounted the horrific events that had occurred in Gibeah, and the fury of the tribes only intensified. They determined that the city of Gibeah, and by extension, the tribe of Benjamin, must be punished. But instead of surrendering, the Benjamites chose to protect the men of Gibeah, refusing to hand over the guilty. This act of defiance created an even deeper rift between the tribes. Israel united against Benjamin, and the path to war became inevitable. The tribes of Israel assembled a mighty army, with over 400,000 men ready for battle. They marched against the Benjamites, demanding that justice be served. The tension was palpable, and blood was already crying out for vengeance before the first blow was struck. But the Benjamites, though far fewer in number, were fierce warriors. With only 26,000 men, including 700 chosen for their skill with the sling, they prepared to defend Gibeah and their honor. The days that followed were bloody and brutal. In the first assault, Israel's forces were repelled with heavy losses, surprised by the strength and determination of the Benjamites. The conflict intensified, with both sides suffering great losses. The civil war was not just a battle for justice, but a battle that was tearing Israel apart from within. The battlefields were drenched in Israelite blood, and the flames of destruction consumed what had once been a united nation. With each lost battle, Israel turned to God, seeking His guidance and support. They fasted, offered sacrifices, and pleaded for victory. And so, on the third day, with a new plan in hand and renewed determination, Israel attacked once more. This time, the Benjamites could not withstand the overwhelming fury of the united tribes. Gibeah was taken, and the vengeance that Israel sought was finally carried out. But in the end, as they gazed upon the destruction, the bloodshed, and the bodies of their own brothers lying on the ground, a bitter question arose: had justice been served, or had vengeance consumed them to the point of nearly destroying themselves? When the flames of battle finally died down, the silence that remained was heavy and oppressive. Gibeah was in ruins, and the tribe of Benjamin, once proud and strong, was reduced to little more than 600 men who had fled to the wilderness, hiding in caves in the mountains. The cost of vengeance had been too high. Israel, in its fury for justice, had nearly exterminated one of its own tribes. As the dust settled and the survivors rose to face what had been done, regret began to creep into the hearts of the tribes of Israel. The massacre had been so vast that now an entire tribe of Israel was on the verge of extinction. A lament spread among the Israelites: today, a tribe has been cut off from Israel. They realized, bitterly, that in their pursuit of justice, they had inflicted a deep wound on their own identity as a people. In a belated gesture of compassion, the leaders of Israel gathered to find a way to save the tribe of Benjamin from complete annihilation. They did not want a tribe of the Lord to disappear entirely. So, they devised a plan: the 600 remaining men would receive wives from among the women of Jabesh Gilead, a town that had not sent warriors to fight in the war. In this way, the tribe of Benjamin would have a chance to rebuild. However, the remedy offered could not erase the destruction that had been wrought. The damage was deep. The tribes of Israel returned to their lands, bearing the weight of the lives lost and the destruction they had caused. Gibeah lay in ruins, and the tribe of Benjamin, though saved from extinction, was but a faint echo of what it had once been. And so, the story ends with a bitter reflection. The moral chaos of Israel had led the people to the brink of self-destruction. In the absence of a king, the people followed their own ways, and those ways culminated in tragedy. The final words echo as an eternal warning: in those days, there was no king in Israel, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. This story is a grim reminder of what happens when justice gives way to vengeance and unity is destroyed by fury. A warning that, without leadership and a shared sense of justice, even the most united can fragment, until the people, consumed by their own darkness, are forced to face the void that remains.